thanks very much, Yancy, and thanks for the NTSF for inviting the DTI to make an input at this event. I suppose what I'd like to try and do is perhaps try and ground some of the discussion around the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, and also to put it into a kind of longer-term context, and into, I think, the context of some of the issues that we need to think about from a South African perspective. So, starting off, I think, with the industrial part of the 4IR, I think that there's a very large body of international evidence that's been accumulated that demonstrates that structural transformation, in other words, increasing levels and a shift in the patterns of investment to higher value-added activities has been the fundamental driver of economic development, and virtually every case of rapid economic progress. So manufacturing is the primary site for this process of structural transformation, but it's not the only site in which it's possible, and that's just partly because manufacturing embodies technological acquisition and productivity growth. And as much as there's been no successful cases of countries catching up with the income levels of advanced economies and becoming wealthy without industrialization, there have been no cases of industrialization without industrial policy. So industrialization fundamentally requires appropriate policy measures to expedite these processes of technology acquisition. I think what's also important is to recognize that that for countries to benefit from and participate in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, they need to already have mastered and acquired a significant industrialization base. In other words, this idea that countries can leapfrog into this post-industrial future is very, very questionable. I think another element of the discussion around expedited technological change, Fourth Industrial Revolution, is what is the relationship between industrialization and employment, which is obviously a massive consideration for South Africa. And I think that we have seen important changes in the global economy. So kind of from, let's say, the end of the Second World War until about the 1980s, manufacturing globally in developing countries was a very important primary source of kind of growth of mass employment. But there are a few reasons why, since perhaps particularly the mid-1980s, that direct ability to create mass employment in manufacturing has come under quite significant pressure. One is that there's been a process which is sometimes called the Great Doubling, which is as the global economy entered this process of kind of broad liberalization, and you had very large and populous countries and parts of the world entering global trade and bringing with them massive workforces. So, literally from perhaps the early 1980s, over a period of about 2 decades, you had a doubling of the size of the global workforce that was engaged in international trade because of the entry of China and India and Eastern Europe into trade. So that's created downward pressure. It is also important to recognize that there have been some developments with respect to shifting of certain activities that were traditionally statistically classified as part of manufacturing, which have changed statistical classification and perhaps overstated the extent to which either jobs have been lost in manufacturing or the rate of growth of manufacturing jobs. And that's this phenomenon of outsourcing of some kind of fairly basic services. So whereas previously a manufacturing firm would directly employ cleaners, security staff, etc., those have been outsourced and statistically become classified as part of services. And that has certainly been a factor in the South African economy. But notwithstanding this downward pressure and this kind of statistical phenomenon around employment, manufacturing still remains immensely important, partly because it does still have significant capabilities to create direct jobs, but also because it has very high multipliers through the rest of the economy. So, for instance, the World Bank last year brought out a report indicating that for every job that's created in manufacturing, 3.8 jobs are created elsewhere in the economy. This is much higher than, no other sector has that kind of indirect employment creation effect. What is also extremely important is that industrialization is necessary to generate the income and the balance of and export revenue to sustain jobs in other sectors of the economy, retail and a whole range of services sectors. So these relationships are very kind of integrated across sectors. Another phenomenon to take into account is that increasingly the boundaries between sectors have become much fuzzier. So when we talk about manufacturing, it's often, people will talk about manufacturing versus services, when in fact manufacturing, as it becomes more sophisticated, increasingly becomes about, the core manufacturing activities, but then a range of kind of high skill and high value service activities, engineering, design, and so forth, that are also kind of bundled together and form part of the manufacturing kind of ecosystem. I think another phenomenon that is tremendously important is to recognize the industrialization of the importance of the industrialization of agriculture. And this is something I'll come back to because I think it's a tremendous opportunity for the South African economy. I'm sure on these screens this is a bit hard to read, but this, one way, I think this is quite a good way of indicating how fundamentally important manufacturing is. And so this shows the growth of manufacturing across a range of developing countries. And its relationship with the overall growth of the economy, GDP growth. And what one can see, although there's some variations, that there's a very clear positive relationship between the rate of growth of manufacturing in an economy and the overall rate of growth of the economy itself. So what I wanted to turn to next is, there's a tremendous amount of discussion, hype, you kind of can't really open a newspaper these days without seeing, the phrase Fourth Industrial Revolution. But what do we actually know about the Fourth Industrial Revolution? So I think that, and this is what the World Economic Forum people are telling us, we know that a large part of it is a process of expedited technological change across a number of technological platforms. And I think people are probably now quite familiar with this. Things like digitalization, robotics, the so-called Internet of Things, additive or 3D printing, nanotechnology, biotechnology. But technological change is often more evolution than revolution, if one looks back over time. And I think, as it's been pointed out, and having actually been on a couple of discussions over the last couple of days, including with some really good international people, who've pointed out that various Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies are actually not that new. So robots have actually been around at least since the 1970s, if not earlier. 3D printing has been around maybe since the early 1990s. It takes quite considerable period of time for these technologies to reach a stage where they've become very widely diffused. And part of that is because there's a distinction between commercial and technological viability. So something might be technologically viable, but that doesn't automatically make it commercially viable. So things that are, kind of being developed in the R&D pipeline, it take quite a considerable period of time before they become adopted, and their scale of production and use is such that costs get driven down sufficiently for these technologies to be widely adopted. And I think what was also happening in some cases, there are also some countervailing forces. So, one of the things that's holding back, for instance, an expansion of, a fuller expansion of the Internet of Things are concerns about cybersecurity and hacking, So, technically, it's very easy. Cars, for instance, increasingly are, embodying wireless technologies and so forth. But, people can hack into cars, people can hack into vehicles, and that has very significant implications for safety. And I mean, that's just one of many examples. So I would suggest that the way we need to think about the fourth industrial revolution is that we need to integrate fourth industrial revolution considerations into the strategies of firms, into the strategies of sectors and industrial strategies, but that doesn't mean that we drop everything else, and only think about the fourth industrial revolution. It's one amongst a number of things that we increasingly need to think about and integrate. And I would also suggest that, and particularly turning to the specific challenges that the South African economy has, is that often the largest challenge is solving the kind of finding ways to solve some of the bigger kind of political economy difficulties and problems that we have, of which we need to integrate technological considerations into. I'll try and draw that out. There are three kind of examples, where I think one can try and draw out, where does how is this expedited technological change actually going to impact itself in particular sectors of the South African economy? So three examples. So one is, I would say, we need to think about what I would call an automotive and mining nexus. And the reasons for that may not be immediately obvious, but hopefully I can make them, kind of more evident. So what we're seeing, although, is a global shift to electric vehicles. We don't know the precise pace. We don't know how long it will take for electric vehicles to reach critical mass, but I mean, there is a very clear kind of shift towards electric vehicles. And that has massive implications for South Africa's mining industry. Why? Because internal combustion engine vehicles use catalytic converters to limit their emissions. 40% of global demand for platinum group metals is as the catalyst in a catalytic converter. So as we see this global shift to electric vehicles, the demand for catalytic converters is going to decline. And that poses, a very serious threat to what is now our largest mining sector, the platinum group metals. So what that implies is that we need to strategize collectively across a wide range of players to develop new sources of demand for PGMs. And I think the most obvious or the most evident of those are emerging around the so-called hydrogen economy, the development of fuel cells in which PGMs are the kind of catalyst. And this requires quite broad partnerships in order to ensure that that new phase of industrialization, or a significant part of it, happens in South Africa. I think what we also need to be doing is engaging with things like developments with electric vehicle batteries, because there are problems and limitations to lithium-ion batteries, which are kind of the base of current electric vehicles, and people are looking for alternative minerals to the ones that are at the core of these batteries, notably cobalt, for a range of reasons which can get into if you want. And so it's really important that we are part of that. We get in at the ground floor of the hydrogen economy, together with our platinum sector. That we ensure that in various ways there are industrial linkages that are forged between mining and manufacturing, and that includes, partly it's around ensuring that we become producers of fuel cells, partly it's around further development of mining equipment. And in fact, underground mining vehicles, are part of the vehicle, one of the group of vehicles that are being piloted using as users of fuel cell technology. I think within the Southern African region, the rise of electric vehicles is also going to have impacts on the mining sector in other countries. So electric vehicles require much more copper. That has an impact on the Zambian economy, the Congo. Cobalt. Congo is the largest producer of cobalt for lithium-ion batteries. But more broadly, and in the context of this kind of new dawn that we find ourselves in, under the new political administration, and this notion that we need as a country to try and forge new deals, we need to be able to forge between the state, between various parts of the business, the mining sector, manufacturing, social partners, labor, a kind of long-term compact that enables the development, the maximization of the gains from the kind of PGM economy, but also averting the risks of ending up with stranded assets, of stranded minerals, that no longer have the value that they have historically had, for the reasons that I've mentioned. And I think that there is a chance to bind together these these objectives, which include, in addition to the industrialization objectives, transformation objectives, social investment in mining communities, and so forth. I don't know how much time I have. Maybe I'll just do one more sectoral example, but you can guide me. Okay, all right. So I think another example of where the fourth industrial revolution is manifesting itself, and we don't think about this as an area of kind of deep technological change, is in agriculture, and high-value agriculture in particular. And what is happening is, I think traditionally, and economists are very guilty of this, development economists, saying agriculture is backward, you want to move people out of agriculture into modern high, activities like manufacturing. But that is a crude portrayal of actually what is happening and what is possible. The point is, you want to move people from very low kind of subsistence type of activities, and unemployment, into higher productivity activities where they can command better wages and improve. We can improve kind of livelihoods, particularly in rural areas. So the Bureau for Agricultural Policy at Stellenbosch University they've done an estimate that they reckon South Africa could create in the order of about 100,000 jobs in high-value, labor-intensive, export-oriented horticultural products. So this is products like apples, like pears, like citrus, macadamian, various, nuts, these types of products. There is an enormous global market for these products. In fact, one could say that actually there is for practical purposes, there's unlimited global demand for these products. We do not have a demand problem. The only issue we have is a supply constraint. How much can we produce? We can sell as much as we can produce. And what is so interesting about the sector is that it's an example where fairly targeted insertion of high technology and high skill can concurrently catalyze large-scale, unskilled, relatively unskilled employment. And I've seen this, for instance, looking at what's been done in the Apple industry in South Africa, where the industry is making very sophisticated investments, at the horticultural level, in irrigation, using all the apples that they can't sell, they will use, as biomass to generate energy for their plants. They've made a whole range of investments along the logistics and the cold chain in order to get those apples fresh onto a supermarket in London or New York or Tokyo, wherever it may be. And this is high tech. But simultaneously, the growth, these horticultural products employ far more people per hectare than things like maize, wheat, livestock, etc., etc. So it doesn't automatically follow that the insertion of technology is job destroying. There are areas where the insertion of technology can actually unlock large-scale job creation. Again, is the biggest problem that we need to solve a technological problem? I don't think it is. I think the biggest problem we need to solve is a political economy problem of forging kind of set of accommodations around things like security of land tenure, ensuring there's sufficient public investment in water, R&D support, appropriate R&D support for the agricultural sector, commitments on the farmer side to decent work practices, to bringing emerging black farmers into these cooperative structures that are selling these products into the global market and making social investments in rural communities. I was going to talk about the kind of manufacturing and retail, but I think probably we've run out of time, so maybe we can just leave it at that.